very exciting papers today. One is nominated for the Best Grad Paper Award, and the other one of the others is nominated for the Best Paper Award. So our first paper is being presented by Amanda Barney and her colleague. I guess you're presenting the paper, but the paper's by Amanda and her colleague. And she'll tell us about that. And it's about connecting curricular design and identity change, an epistemic network analysis. And Amanda is at Drexel University, and you can introduce your paper.
Thanks so much.
We lost you.
I know something funny happened just when it hit record. Here we go. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Barbara. As you said, I'm Amanda Barney. I am now a postdoctoral scholar at Drexel University School of Education, and I worked on this paper and then this project led by my advisor, Dr. Rudis Foster, who leads the Games and Learning and Interactive Digital Environments Lab, and Dr. Mamta Shah, who's here, hello, thanks, who was the postdoctoral scholar on this career project. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about the work that we did around identity exploration and supporting that through curricular design. Let me go. There we go. So the first thing to mention is that when we think about learning, which is the area of interest, we're thinking about it less as this sort of passive, static accumulation of knowledge, and we want to reconceptualize it as something that is active, personalized, intentional, in a sense related to your identity. So we conceptualize learning as this process of identity exploration over time. And we think of this as this developmental process whereby you're connecting information, knowledge, or domains to yourself, and you're doing that repeatedly over time. And as you do that, you develop and grow, building on how you conceptualized yourself in the past, and projecting forward how you might conceptualize yourself in the future. So if this idea of developmental growth sounds like it might align with anything, it's because we feel like it does. We see connections between this and the moving stanza window that can be applied to longitudinal data using epistemic network analysis. And so anytime we talk about identity exploration, we are organizing our data by individual and not as an aggregate across all students. And that way, one reflective post on how they see themselves in one moment can be meaningfully connected to how they saw themselves in the moment immediately prior and prior and prior. And so that was the focus of our use of epistemic network analysis in this context, which I'll talk a little bit about. And when we think about identity, we're thinking about different aspects as it connects to the self. The cognitive element of how you think about it, the knowledge connected to a specific domain, such as the ones that we'll talk about here, environmental science and urban planning. We're thinking about personal interests and valuing how this is relevant to you, how this is interesting and how you might want to pursue it. We're thinking about your behaviors. How are you goal setting? How are you self-monitoring? How are you structuring that process? And then finally, you're thinking explicitly, how are you defining yourself? Do you see yourself as, for example, an urban planner, or do you see yourself in one of those roles or not? And so these four areas are what we think about when we think about this process of developmental growth over time. Dr. Foster received a career grant in 2014 to design an implementation that would encourage students to engage in this intentional iterative process of identity exploration over time related to environmental science and urban planning. And we'll talk a little bit about the third of 3 implementations that we enacted using design-based research, whereby we built upon the existing research for the benefits of both virtual and in-person supportive curricular activities for encouraging identity exploration, and then we implemented them in an environmental. So it was a weekly implementation with students from a local high school who they would travel to a science museum, and then there was STEM specific programming offered to the students, and we were one of those programs. And so we implemented that 3 times at the local science museum, and we built upon what we assessed from each iteration to improve upon the final session 3. So the first 2 sessions were a bit longer. They were 10 weeks and 9 weeks each, and the third session was quite a bit shorter, only 4 weeks. And by week, I mean day, because each week we only met the students once. And so even though initially we used a redesigned version of land science developed by the epistemic analytics group, in the 4-week session, this was not something that we were able to do because we wouldn't have had time to have them explore that complexity. So we instead created analogous curricular interventions that we could be done in person across those 4 periods that we worked with those students. And you'll see these are some of the collaborative in-person paper design activities that we did. And I'll talk a little bit more about the curricular designs we implemented. So this is an example of how we really wanted to be very intentional when we were designing each curricular intervention. And we wanted to make sure that we were encouraging students at repeated and different points throughout each of the 4 times that we met with them to reflect on these 4 elements of self: cognitive, behavioral, affective, and how they self-defined. And so this is just one example of how we tried to be very intentional in connecting those things. But what we were curious about moving with this particular project was the intentionality that we brought into the design of each activity across the 4 sessions. Did that play out in the outcomes for students' processes of identity exploration across each of the weeks? And if so, in what ways? In what ways was there alignment, not alignment? What can we learn about how to better design these implementations in the future? So that's what we'll see in the epistemic networks that I'll show here in just a moment. This is how we set up the epistemic network models. And just a reminder again, we broke it up by student data, which is presented then longitudinally, and then we want to show it by week here, and we also segmented by week because there were gaps in their periods of reflection. And we had a pretty strong goodness of fit for the models that you're about to see. But if you have any more questions about this, we can talk a little bit later about that. So here is the epistemic network model for week 1 session data. And you can see the mean scores for, thank you so much. You can see the mean scores for weeks 1 through 4 are posted here as well. And so week 1 has a comparatively strong weighted line between their reflections on their knowledge and their sense of self, and then also on their interests and their sense of self. So let's look at some of the data from the week 1 intervention to see if we can have some understanding of why they might be making those connections a little bit stronger. So here is one of the questions that we asked students to reflect on. Think about yourself in 10 years. What would you enjoy doing? And you can see that some of their reflections had very clear ideas of what roles they wanted to pursue in the future. Many of those were not urban planning related, and that's totally understandable. We are not expecting everyone to want to be an urban planner at the end of this experience, but they were able to make connections to what they wanted to do in some cases were valuable, either to science or to some aspect of the curriculum that we ended up using with the students. And that helped because it was set in the Philadelphia context. They were dealing with issues that are relevant to the area in which they live, and they can see the issues around them and were able to apply and make connections in that way. And so a lot of the discussion and the questions that we asked them in the initial week of the intervention, it shows that there might have been a connection between what we were encouraging them to explore and what they ended up reflecting. And of course, you can see that in some cases, they didn't start out with as strong. So this second student didn't particularly have initial interest in this topic. But later on, we can see that there's an overall trajectory of development towards interest in the students as a whole. So let's look at week 2 in comparison. So we've got here a much different model. You can see that there is a much stronger connection making process here between their reflections on their knowledge and their interests specifically. So those 2 things. And I looked at this and I knew exactly why, and I was very happy to see it because the activity that we implemented with them in week 2 was the know, want to know, and learn activity. We presented them with paper materials regarding a variety of different issues facing the Philadelphia area related to pollution, to economics, to infrastructure. And we asked them to read through whatever was interesting to them, write about what they knew about urban planning from this point, from week 2, then pose questions that they wanted to answer and research them themselves using the materials that we had on hand. And so I was thrilled to see students making these really interesting connections between, seeking out the areas that were of particular targeted interest to them, and then expressing and gaining knowledge and reflecting on that through their processes. And so I like this particular student as well, because he's really making a connection in the left-hand quote, impact of our actions, and now we can rebuild and renew our city of brotherly love. I just love that. So I was happy to see those connections reflected in the model. And then we see here, this is week 3, and the strongest connection in this intervention, this activity, was between self-organization and self-control and their knowledge. And this also makes a lot of sense when we look at the curricular implementation. So in this week, we presented them with huge blown up posters of downtown Center City in Philadelphia. And we had them each individually in small groups, design them using paper layouts of how they would like whether they would have industrial areas or environmental areas or economically focused areas. And so they had them redesign the city of downtown Philadelphia individually. And then they had to compete or collaborate to create a universal model that met the needs of each of their individual groups, because some of them had environmental focus, some of them had economic focus, which we tailored to their affirmed interests in the early weeks of the intervention. And this was one of my favorite experiences in this intervention, because they really took it a step further. They were making deals. They were trying to find groups that they allied with that were, you like environmental stuff? Okay, yeah. And then it ended with this huge debate about whether or not industry should be centered in the downtown, in the central part of a city. Why or why not? Some students advocated for it, some against. And this is something that emerged spontaneously from the group as a result of this activity. And so you can see that they're really being intentional about their goal setting, what they want, and in their data, we saw that they were really detailed here about how they were taking steps to achieve it. And finally, in the fourth week, we have a slightly more balanced connection making. We see self-definition and self-perception. We see knowledge, and we see interest valuing. A little bit less are there talking about their processes here. And the primary activity that we engaged in with them in this session was having them write up a final report of their overall experience, their final outcomes in their map design, how they saw themselves. And so you can kind of understand why we were much more intentional about encouraging them to reflect on all aspects. But as you can see, even though we wanted them to reflect on aspects of their process, many of them didn't actually choose to do so, or their data didn't reflect that they reflected on that, even that they might have other ways. So that's something for us to note. We wanted this to be a balanced model, but we might need to design in future more intentional opportunities for them to reflect on self-organization and self-control. So what I also want to point out, the final note before my 10 minutes is up here, is that you can see the clustering of each individual student. That's what these scores are. In weeks 1 and weeks 4, where we had more targeted questions, there is more clustering. And it shows that when we prompt them to reflect more specifically, their final reflections obviously are going to be more in line with each other. But when we have activities that promote more open-ended discussion, we can see students moving in different directions of their choosing, and their trajectories become more unique. I think that it's best to have a mix of both of those things, that we're encouraging them to reflect intentionally on different aspects of the self, but also giving them a chance to personalize their experiences. And that was one of my favorite findings from this particular analysis of the data. So there's a lot of future work we want to do on this. We want to look at cross-session comparisons. We want to look at curricular design in sessions 1 and 2, which did have digital components, and see what that looks like in comparison to this non-digital curricular intervention. We want to look at, see if we can model somehow what our intentions were, maybe build networks on our intentionality in curricular design against the actual outcomes of students. It might be tricky to do, but it would be interesting. And of course, we need to track long-term trajectories of growth. We want to see if students are taking these skills that they might be developing through engagement in our intervention and applying them in other ways. So thank you so much. I really look forward to questions and discussions at the end of this, but I think my time is up, and we will, if you want to read more about this, here are some things that we've published on the design of and implementation of this project. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You can download the papers from the chat if you're interested in that. Okay, our second paper is being presented by Jay Sprohinski, and he's presenting some work he's done with his colleagues at University of Wisconsin. And his paper is entitled Trajectories in Epistemic Network Analysis. There you go.
Great, thank you so much. Now I've been freezing a little bit throughout your presentation, Amanda. So if I get choppy, could someone just let me know, and I might have to turn off my video. But hopefully that won't happen. So as we just saw, research that focuses on process needs to account for change over time. And trajectory models, which show a particular path through time, are one way to do this. However, with some notable exceptions, ENA has mostly been used to build aggregate models, which obscure change over time. So today I'd like to talk about a new approach to visualizing trajectories. I'll briefly describe the problem space, including obstacles and path solutions, and then I'll describe a study that we carried out using trajectories to test and demonstrate how they work. So one of the main affordances of ENA is that the position of any point is interpretable based on its X or its Y coordinates, and often researchers use information from both dimensions simultaneously to draw conclusions. So here we see Fisher et al. They showed that a coach's discourse network relative to high-performing teams was defined by high X values and low Y values, therefore requiring a multidimensional interpretation. In trajectory models, each ENA point needs to be interpreted by an additional third variable, time. And this is the core design challenge for trajectories in ENA, how to show the relationship between these three crucial variables without making a model just too confusing to read. So given this constraint, previous ENA trajectories have been limited to small numbers of time units. For instance, here we see Espino et al. And Nash and Schaefer both displaying change over 3 time units. And while limiting the number of time units certainly reduces complexity, some analyses just require more. So another option employed by Rogers et al. Was to substitute time for one of the ENA dimensions, thereby showing change in time over the other ENA dimension. So here we can see change along an honor, fear, and love, death axis over 5 acts in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. However, as we just saw, interpretations can rely on both axes simultaneously. And so changes in a reordered plot like this one may need to be considered in relation to the corresponding changes in the other ENA dimension over time and to the original ENA model itself. In this sense, the 3 variable problem can be decomposed into 3 pairs, and these simpler models can be aligned alongside one another to graphically and mathematically coordinate. So this was the basis for our design idea, and the next step for us was to test it. To do so, we used data from a study I did with an experiential science curriculum called BookBits. 5 groups of 5 to 7 university students were asked to determine the subject of an unknown text using only fragments like these from its pages. And these fragments are from an 1830s anatomy and physiology textbook that is told through an excruciatingly extensive architectural metaphor. So the activity was structured in 3 rounds, and each round was divided into a presentation and discussion section. In the first round, teams received 4 to 8 of these architecturally based fragments. In the second round, they traded half of their fragments with another group. And then in the third round, each team received new fragments containing words like anatomy, physiology, skeletons, etc. These rounds of presentation and discussion were recorded and transcribed, and codes were created using an iterative grounded approach. We came up with 2 overarching categories, one in which ideas were generated and one dissenting against them. And then based on the data, each category was subdivided, creating 3 generative and dissenting pairs. So you can see the hypothesis, supporting evidence, and agreement are the generative codes, refutation, falsifying evidence, and disagreement, dissenting ones. To construct the trajectory models, we divided the data into 6 time units based on the presentation and discussion of each of the 3 rounds. And we created an ENA for the 5 groups across the entire activity. Here I'm just showing one group, the aggregate network for one group. And you can see the axes here defined by hypothesis and agreement in the X dimension, and falsifying and supporting evidence in the Y dimension. And then here you can see the 6 time units for this group, along with the aggregate mean, and then just the time units in the space. And so what we did was we reordered this by time, and aligned all the points. And then we connected all of the points using splines. So now here you have the side plot on the left showing change in the Y dimension over time, the bottom plot showing change in X over time. And in the main plot, the squares representing the current, in this case, the final time step, and the triangles representing previous ones. So with the trajectories made, we compared the models to our previous qualitative analysis. Thank you, Barbara. These are 2 other groups, and this is the first trajectories for the first half of the activity. The starting points are very different, with the blue groups mean positioned far into the hypothesis side of the space, and the red groups being much more central. Going back to the data, we see that the red group's discourse was balanced across generative and dissenting codes, as seen here by Jane, agreeing that the text is about houses, but not about wooden ones, and then using fragments to support both of these ideas. On the other hand, the blue group's discourse began dominated by generative codes, specifically hypotheses, Here you can see Cam and Ben offering different ideas one after the other. The textbook, it's a textbook about comparative architecture, or maybe it's just some fiction. Also noteworthy are the changes in the Y positions. Both groups increase at time 2 and decrease at time 3. And this aligns with the structure of the activity. Groups are making more connections to supporting evidence when they're presenting their own ideas in the odd numbered time units, and they're making more connections to falsifying evidence and refutation during the interactional discussion and debates that follow. Now here you see the trajectories across the entire activity. You can notice again that the final means are very different again. The red groups is far in the supporting evidence part of the space, and the blue has high X and high Y values indicating connections to agreement and dissenting codes like refutation. Once again, going back to the data, we see individual members of the red group now just offering lists of supporting evidence and hypothesis, and importantly, no longer using dissenting codes to address each other's claims. On the other hand, the blue group is increasingly agreeing that the text is actually an architectural metaphor and using refutation to home in on the specifics of this metaphor. Now, if we look at the bottom plot here, we can see the final changes in X values fit the structure of the activity. For instance, at time 4, the groups had been working with the same data for over half an hour and were making increased connections to agreement. And time 5 here is where the anatomy and physiology evidence was introduced, catalyzing increased connections to hypothesis as groups worked to accommodate the new data. Now, while we were mainly concentrating on validating the coherence of these trajectories, it's worth noting that they also offered new interpretations of the data. For instance, the blue group was the only group that came to consensus around an idea. And if we consider their shift from hypothesis to agreement, alongside this up and down movement that they have between supporting evidence and the dissenting codes, we might hypothesize that when working toward consensus, new ideas benefit from a period of support in order for argument to be productive. Finally, in our comparisons, we asked, do the trajectories offer information unavailable in our aggregate plots? Well, yes. The aggregate models for these two groups showed no significant difference, but by dividing the activity into appropriate units, we were able to get rich, consistent, and otherwise unavailable interpretations. And importantly, by decomposing the main trajectory into reordered side plots, we were able to easily discern these differences as well as patterns pertaining to the overall structure of the activity. So this approach to trajectory still needs to be tested with other data sets, and future work needs to account for displaying more than 2 trajectories at once, as well as even greater numbers of time steps. You can imagine how adding a 3rd trajectory or even doubling the number of time units would quickly complicate the model. The epistemic analytics group is working to develop an R package that includes all of the features presented here, as well as animated transitions between the time units so you can actually see them move. So hopefully we'll have more on that in the near future. In the meantime, thanks for your time and your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I'm sure there's going to be some questions. In case you haven't caught, we do the questions at the end. And so we're moving to our last paper. This paper is actually nominated as a best paper for the conference, and it's being presented by Luis Prieto, and it's by him and his colleagues in the University of Tallinn, and Brendan has been involved as well in this paper. And the title is The Value of Epistemic Network Analysis in Single Case Learning Analytics, a Case Study of Lifelong Learning. Here you go, Luis.
Thank you. I hope you guys can hear me. So thanks for the presentation. So then I will not just say the same things again. And just for those that are not aware, I was not aware before I went to work there, Estonia is actually here in this faraway corner of Europe. So yeah, here is where we work, except for Brendan. He has to stick with Wisconsin. So it was very nice to see Amanda's presentation, because we are actually working in some similar problems in a sense. So we are looking in our research context and research problems, we are looking at non-cohort based educational settings, like places where cohorts are actually not so common or not so meaningful. So things like lifelong learning, doctoral education, teacher professional development, special needs, things like that. So in these kind of settings, the learning process is so unique. The contexts are also so influential and so unique in each case. And also the individual differences that, that makes it kind of meaningless to compare a learner with another learner. And this also lends itself very well to the use of qualitative or ethnographic methods. But of course, this is also, as we all know, quite difficult and slow to make these studies and get insights from them with the problem that which actually we were mentioning before the session started. The students seldom directly benefit from the insights we get from these studies, which is kind of a pity, And so then we were asking ourselves, okay, could a more learning analytics approach help here? Of course, not in the usual way, because learning analytics normally requires a lot of data points, and if you only have one learner, I mean, there's a limit to how many data you can gather about this learner. But we are, thinking about this kind of approach, which we have called single case learning analytics. And those of you interested, you can go to the paper to read in more detail about the approach itself. But I mean, a few interesting or peculiar aspects of this approach is we gather longitudinal data, as we also have seen in the previous papers here. But also we combine qualitative and quantitative data. Okay, so it's kind of a mixed approach. And the idea is that with this more unstructured or qualitative data, we try to capture multiple contextual variables that we wouldn't be able to capture with this kind of a priori quantitative data gathering. So because you have to set it up beforehand to gather these variables. So we hope the unstructured data will help us gather these things that were not in the initial design, let's say. So then, because this approach is quite new, we're still testing it out. So our main research questions in this paper were basically, first, what kind of insights can be drawn from this kind of data, kind of this very small data set longitudinal of a single learner. But also, we were trying to see, okay, what's the added value of this adding new complexity of having this qualitative data and so on. So what is the added value of adding this qualitative data into the data set, and especially what is the added value of ENA, epistemic network analysis, in extracting those insights? So in order to answer these questions, we did in the paper this illustrative case study of a single lifelong learner, which we called Adam. And so the data we had from Adam, so it's Adam's diary and self-tracking data. So he's a lifelong learner. And so he's learning as a professional, actually as a researcher. So probably many of you will be able to relate to this learner. So we have the data from his diary entries for 6 months in the workday. So that was 166 entries. And for each of these days, we had quantitative variables, things like sleep hours, hours spent doing creative work or self-defined creative work, learning, doing pomodoros. If any of you is a fan of the pomodoro technique, you know what that is. And also, and this was a bit the outcome variable that was more important for us, what was the overall satisfaction of Adam with this particular workday. And also, there was this unstructured journal entry about what are the events and the thoughts or feelings of the day. So the question Adam had, which we tried to answer for him using this kind of method, is, okay, what makes for a good day at my work? Are they telling me something that I don't know already about what's a good and a bad day? So the methods we used, basically we had, these are the two elements of the diaries that we have, qualitative and quantitative. So as a sort of baseline, we have a step one, which was just take more this quantified self approach, which is quite common for many other things, and do a little bit of visual analysis, so just do some plots of the data, and then some quantitative models using only the quantitative variables. And because we wanted Adam to be able to interpret them, so we use simple models like linear regression or regression trees. And then now is when the interesting thing starts. So first thing, we use just the raw unstructured data to also give a bit of meaning or helping close the interpretive loop. Yes, thanks, Barbara. Close the interpretive loop that these coefficients in the models give. So trying to understand better what the purely quantitative models say. But also, since we also coded this unstructured data with using two coding schemes, one top-down based on a map-less work on progress and setbacks, and another one more bottom-up, like this open coding. And as a first, let's say, enhanced model, we use these code counts of each day as simple regressors in models, along with the quantitative ones. And again, but then, of course, we did like the more interesting thing, which was, okay, we used ENA to visualize these codes and see, okay, like, do they tell us something more about these, these good days versus bad days dilemma. And and also we use these ENA dimensions of, so each day would have like what's a point in this two-dimensional or four-dimensional space. So we use them as regressors as well. We added them to the models, and so if they provide us with additional value. And then we did like evaluation or comparison of the different parameters of the different models to see, okay, like adding these new sources of data was actually adding value. Like, were we able to better predict what a good day is and what a bad day is? So, and of course, I hope it's clear that basically research question 1 is linked to this step 2, where we are trying to see what kind of things come up from this, adding the qualitative side to the analysis, while research question 2 is about this model comparison to see, okay, like, does it really help us, for example, predict what a good day is? So this, like, there's more results. I will just go very briefly through some of them. So this is like the step 1 model we have, which is like one of the regression trees, which basically, I don't know if you're able to see, because I have my screen kind of, okay. So it has just 2 variables, like these pomodoros, for example, and I think it's learning, although I cannot see it right now, as the main variables, and it gives gives Adam an idea of, okay, like, what are the thresholds for when, you know, something starts becoming a good day, a bad day, and so on. But then, what does ENA, for example, jump in to more like later steps in the process that we follow? So the ENA visualization gave us something like this, for example, and here you can see these are just like the 10 most common codes, because if you remember, we have like 64 in total, and that would be really messy to visualize. But at least even with the first 10 codes, that already gave us some interesting insights. You can see this pink part is the bad days, the blue part is the good days, and they're means rotated. So you can see they're aligned, let's say, on the x-axis. So for example, just to give an example, like this, for example, the importance, which was unexpected for Adam, was like this importance of these informal work social events, like things like going for lunch with the colleagues. So, and here you can see this example. Okay, focused day of work. Focus also appears quite prominently over here. So I started a bit earlier, managed to get closer to my plans, even if there were still changes and delays. And there were some good news, and lunch with my colleagues also helped to get my spirits up. Okay, so you can see like the good days and some of the relationships there, like, for example, like a concrete research project Adam was working on. So he got some ideas that, oh, like, you know, maybe I should do more of those things. And for the bad side, for example, we can see lots of long hours, hecticness, physical exhaustion, long hours. So it became clear that maybe, you know, Adam should cut back a little bit on the hours, as many of us probably you know, identify with. So this is an example, like another hectic, fragmented day, back-to-back meetings, some of them okay with students, still lunch in front of the computer, and general sense of being surpassed by work and not get tired and spent. So, I mean, I guess you see, like, it was really helpful for Adam, and we saw some relationships and some, like, the disposition of codes was in some cases quite surprising. And we also, as I mentioned, we use these dimensions in our models. So actually, like, the best performing model that we had at the end of all these steps that I showed you before is actually a model in which you can see these 2 ENA dimensions actually feature several times at different points in the tree. So actually, we see that actually they provide quite a lot of useful information in order to predict, what a good and a bad day was. Yeah, so probably I'm running out of time, so I will just go quickly through the implications of an issues. So we found in our paper that adding this qualitative data in ENA does help, both in closing this interpretive loop and getting like additional insights from the data, but also in the modeling. So if we want to like at some point have a predictor or have these kind of predictive models are actually enhanced by using these ENA dimensions, for example. And I mean, the whole paper itself just tries to provide an example of another way to mix methods that maybe, as it kind of also draws upon other work like people like Dragan Gasevich has done with social network analysis, studying like those kinds of parameters as well, along with ENA. But our focus here is on end user usage as well. So like really trying to provide as soon as possible some value for the learner themselves. But there are, of course, like limitations and open issues. So we have not really even touched real temporal modeling here in this example. We have some, but we had to, put it out because it didn't fit into the paper. But things like the learner trajectory. So I was really interested to see the other papers. I really hope Jace will tell us when we can use this tool because it looks really cool. And I think Adam would love to see his trajectory as well, like month by month, for example. Yeah, then there's a question of can learners really benefit from and understand the ENA visualizations, or should we provide some kind of watered down version, or how do we make this available to the learners themselves? Right now, we are starting to use this with doctoral students, which some of them might be able to actually interpret this. So we are starting with baby steps in that direction. But I think it is a wider issue in quantitative ethnography. We're also discussing at the beginning. So whether we have cases or we want to start building what are good practices for learner usage of ENA or end user usage of ENA, if that makes sense. And maybe another issue related to the coding. So I didn't go really very deeply into what coding scheme we used, which is probably bad practice, I would say, in QE. But so in these kind of settings, we resorted to open coding, and we think that's very important to have this function of capturing unknown in advance elements of the context or of the process that we then take into account in our initial framing. But then, if we start like condensing these open codes into, let's say, less number of more abstract codes, I have the impression that sometimes the actionability gets a bit diluted. So like, I don't know if Adam would really have any value from like just seeing 4 nodes with very abstract concepts there. Maybe yes, but then like, I feel there's this tension, and this is also like maybe an open issue to discuss in a wider community. Like, do we have any guidelines of what level of abstraction to use, how to manage this tension between actionability and clean visualization in a sense. And that's it. I hope I was not very much over time, but yes, please ask lots of questions in the discussion round, and please drop me an email if you want more information about this. Thank you.
Okay. You just were a few minutes, but that's okay. No problem. Okay, so we can say thank you to the presenters. 3 very interesting papers, and I think many of us are very interested in this idea of showing learning as processes and trajectories and things like that. So we open the floor to questions. We have about 20 minutes. So does anyone have a question? You can either speak up or write your question in the chat. Does anyone have a question to start off?
I have a comment. Oh, Mark, go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right, we'll both be polite then. I'll try to go quick. First of all, thank you guys for all 3 fantastic presentations. I have a toddler here trying to help me out too. And there's a few things that I wanted to kind of point out. One thing I think is a challenge that folks have in 10 minutes trying to do justice to their qualitative understanding of things. It's very difficult. And I think Luis put his finger on it at the end, is how many codes we include or not. And when would models kind of reach stability? I mean, I'm thinking of the PRIA model, for those of you who saw that can take codes in or out, but in Luis's case, you'd see things changing over time. So I was kind of thinking about DBR cycles, borrowing from what Amanda was talking about. How could you incorporate that potentially in this lifelong cycle in terms of having some process or regularity of adjusting your coding, et cetera? I also really liked I think I heard at least 2 people say ENA telling us more, but it wasn't the only thing they used. I thought that the researchers also talked about their kind of qualitative dives or other types of quantitative analyses, and I like the connections there. One of the things that I saw in June's talk yesterday, if you guys haven't seen his sociosemantic network analysis, was he had this idea of a lifetime of a network. And so one of the challenges with, like, even what Jace showed, is that you have these snapshots that are like locked in time. But what June and Ayano did was they actually used a moving stanza window to make networks. And it could be computationally intensive, but I think that might be a really interesting thing to consider too, is I think the same arguments Jace is making could even be pushed towards seeing the time points in between. But anyways, I just thought that there was, I think the tensions that you guys highlighted, on top of the fact that you did great work, you highlighted some tensions that we need to tackle. Amanda Baraney, gift of gab. I mean, you were like moving and trying to, like, it's clear you have a lot that you want to show. And I think that it's
I'm talking with my hands, yeah.
Yeah, and how do we make decisions about how much complexity we can show with the models versus, and everybody had qualitative examples too. And like, it's difficult, especially in 10 minutes, but I think that, anyways, great job and a lot of great ideas generated. So thank you all.
I think so. Mark, you had a comment too.
Yeah, well, I was, it's really a reflection on Jace's presentation, but actually it relates to the others as well. The most interesting thing I think that struck me in what you did was you fed more and more information as the exercise was going on. And I mean, I'm particularly interested in information theory. And effectively what you're doing is you're increasing the constraint. And if you increase the constraint, you get more information, because obviously the information is more tightly packed effectively. It's like, you know, tightening up your laws of grammar. And maybe that's something to think about if you want to move forwards to doing predictive work, is actually think about the constraints, because really conversation, the utterances that people make are self-organizing behavior within constraints. That's effectively what happens when we talk to each other. And if you change the constraints, you see changes in people's utterance. So it's just a thought really, but I think it probably applies to all of them really.
Yeah,
I think that was
thanks,
one of
Mark.
the things that, oh, sorry, who's that?
Oh, no, you can go. I'll go after. It's fine.
No worries. The question was directed at you, so I'll follow up.
Okay, we can both be polite again. No, that's a helpful reframing for me, because I was thinking about it in terms of simplification, and I really like the idea of constraint, and I think that can push me in different directions. One thing and that popped into my head that I'm really fascinated by is the work that's happening in conversation analysis in terms of looking at the different structures of conversations. And it's a completely different kind of trajectory, as it were. Yeah. But I keep wanting to know how some of the codes, for instance, that we were using can be automated. Things like refutation, things like dissent, that have that aren't necessarily structured by the specific words that are used, but might have semantic structures that can, through some kinds of constraints, actually be automated. Exactly. So thank you for that.
Amanda?
As a follow-up, I think that tension actually is something that we were grappling with when we were looking at the data, and you know, some of the more tightly constrained opportunities we provided for the learners to reflect, like more targeted questions, versus those opportunities to explore in more open-ended and self-directed ways. Because on the one hand, you're granting them agency to explore these roles and think about themselves in ways that work best for them. But then also you risk losing that intentionality and that encouraging them to think about all of the aspects of the self that can be incredibly valuable to consider. And so that's something that we kind of struggle with practically is, how we don't want to completely dictate every step of this process. We want to have that exploration be open-ended at times, but we want to make sure that they're intentionally thinking about all of the things that, we at least theoretically feel are important.
Mm.
Let me just add one more thing. The students that we worked with came from a school that specifically focused on engagement in science and sort of, helping students explore sort of a pathway in STEM. And as Amanda pointed out earlier, our program or our course was offered in a science museum. So there was this sort of these contextual layers also that these students were aware of and came with, so I feel like that sort of also shaped maybe, their expectations of that, any activity we engage in as part of this larger museum is going to help us think more about science or careers in STEM.
It's the only thing maybe worth thinking about, because there are a lot of learning technologists, Gordon Pask, who most people know only through Diana Laurelard's reinterpretation of him. Really, it's worth looking at what he wrote. It's pretty impenetrable stuff, but he knew what he was doing.
Mm.
I'm making a note. Thank you.
I think I've been pointing them to some of the old work in intelligent tutoring system stuff too, because there's a lot of good things there that are relevant for many things people do today. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any other questions, comments?
I would make one more. Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
No, you can go ahead first.
I was just going to say, I wanted to highlight how people were pushing things forward. I think some people have mentioned at different points in time, separating ENA from QE can be difficult for folks, but I thought Luis showed a really good example of how you can do QE with and combine it with other techniques that and get value. Same thing with Jace talking about he'd done a qualitative analysis and ENA showed him things that he hadn't seen, but also that there were limitations to it. And there's a pushing forward and an openness to trying to customize the tools to to get fidelity to the phenomenon that we care about too. And I think the same thing with some of the pieces with what Amanda was saying is I remember when I first started talking to them about this work, decisions about we don't necessarily want to compare this individual to, this relates to Luis's work too. I don't necessarily want to compare this individual to other folks. I actually want to take them on their own terms, and that's going to define the space. And I think that openness to kind of taking the tools and making them work for you and making decisions about them rather than following it procedurally is something that I think is fantastic in this work. And I think as we teach new people, and there's a lot of complexity that we're picking up, that kind of spirit of using it and having some sort of epistemic stance towards why I'm using this tool and what it's helping me do is great. So I want to applaud the researchers for that.
So maybe just one small comment to that, because this relates to something that came up, I think it was yesterday's poster session, one of the parallel things we had there. So there were some like PhD students, for example, who were trying to wrap their heads around what is QE, what is not QE, is QE ENA, is there non-ENA QE? If you do Markov modeling, then is that QE or not? Can it be? So people, I think, especially like, let's say the newer members of the community, and myself included, are all kind of grappling with this: what is QE and what is the what is the difference? Or so it would be good if at some point, in the community we kind of came up to some, working definitions of, okay, like QE is about this, and if you want to mix methods like this, okay, like what is is there some guidelines or some boundaries we want to set, or we just want, anything goes and just get crazy with your Markov models?
Maybe that can come up in the special session that you're having today on the promises and challenges in the future of QE. Maybe bring that up in that session that'll start at 23 your time. So You'll have to be up late, please.
It's actually something Brendan and I think we were talking about in one of the coffee breaks a while back about, this finding this balance between offering, practical, foundational insights into how we see ourselves as a community in a field or method or what we are. That kind of relates back to the keynote. But then also acknowledging the fact that this is an evolving community and some of those norms are still negotiated and shifting. And so I think we need to try to do a bit of both, which is always the hardest, because then we can accommodate the newcomers while encouraging the innovators.
Yeah, true. Does anyone else have questions?
Yeah, so I would like to ask Louise, how are you working on presenting your ENA to your doctoral students? I'm very interested in how we can use ENA as a visualization to both students and instructors. So how is your experience so far?
You're muted, unfortunately.
You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I should have looked at the icon. So yeah, so we are pretty early in this process. So we did like a small pilot over the spring, summer with, what was it, 9 PhD students. And of course it was like, in the middle of the pandemic. So it was a bit strange study and we've never finished it and probably will do another round this year. But like the response was kind of hit and miss, because also it depends a lot on your your abilities in terms of, are you a visual person or not? Do you like complicated data graphs or not? And because like the kind of visualizations I showed, but I actually, because we didn't have visualizations for them or for their data yet, because we hadn't done the coding, but I showed them like the same visualizations I showed you today, pretty much, like the ones from this Adams data set. And look, I said, oh, what do you think? Do you think this kind of thing would be useful? And I mean, for some of it was like a no, because like I have no idea how to make sense of this and get it out of my sight. And with others, they said, oh, okay, interesting. So maybe the more, let's say, quantitative minded may have better chance to accept it on firsthand. But I think that also has kind of nice opportunities for trying like innovative stuff. Like, for example, we have had this problem with visualization. We work a lot with teachers, and not all teachers also like the learning analytics dashboard thingies. So some of the things that sometimes people say, but can you just make a paragraph of text and just explain to me what the hell I have to do or what happened? Or so, like, can we come up with an ENA explainer that can just generate text and give us a non-visual output of an ENA analysis, other than having a researcher actually going and writing the thing, which is also, of course, like the best thing. But so I think it's hit and miss, but I think there's a space for us to invent new crazy stuff, maybe.
Oh gosh, I hope so. I really do. I just think that's I think kind of connecting to what Brendan said and you, Luis, I think that's a huge next step for the value of QE visualizations in general, and not only for participants, and I think it'll help connect what we learn about these phenomena that we examine, and connect them to the practical applications, either for the participant by showing them, here is your process and here you can see what works, what doesn't work, what you're doing, what you're not doing, but also for us to assess the efficacy of what we're doing. And that was one of my favorite things about sort of turning the ENA back on us and what we designed, to understand what we intend actually manifest, and can we use that to iterate. And that's what I think I really liked, using it as part of our DBR process to tell us how to do better. And I just love to see more work that's coming out along both of those lines.
I'm just curious about what you said there, Amanda, about what works better, what doesn't work better, because none of the work any of you have shown has been making judgments on efficiency or anything like that. At least I didn't hear it in this particular talk. So I was just wondering, how do you bring in that kind of judgments into these things at all? And I'm thinking about one of my colleagues in my department, she has these wonderful models of innovation groups working together. And if you look at everybody individually, you would say some people are really not participating, maybe they're disrupting and things like that. But when you look at them together, when they come out the other end, you need all the roles of all the people over time. So it's really
Absolutely.
hard to look at the individual and say, I don't know, have any of you thought about that in your, or are we just still at the point of trying to understand and visualize the processes?
Well, I think to your point, legitimate peripheral participation is legitimate. And all types of engagement in identity exploration we deem to be valid and useful, whether they're, just talking about their interest or they're affirming a lack of interest. Like any kind of self-reflection is building skill in this tool that will hopefully benefit learners as they move forward to achieve whatever goals they set for themselves. So absolutely, there is no value judgment on the quality of identity exploration that any one person chooses to engage in. With regards to our implementation, what we hoped was to give our group of students that we worked with practice intentionally reflecting on these aspects of self, just to give them a practice doing that. And what I think we noticed, particularly in the week 4 data, was that we'll have to look in greater detail as to what might be causing this, but they were focusing, we were hoping for a balanced model where, based on what we were encouraging them to do, they were reflecting on these 4 aspects of self. And we wanted them to try that at least once. And we didn't see them doing that as strongly with relation to their self-organization and self-control there. So that gives us an indicator that, our goal was to encourage them to reflect in some way intentionally about those 4 aspects of self. And we saw that they didn't do that as strongly in one of those constructs as they did to the other 3. So that lets us know that, there might be a disconnect between what we intend and what the actual reflections were. Not necessarily the outcomes, because also what they say and what they reflect on doesn't always reflect every aspect of their process. But so I only talk about success in terms of relationship to our goals within that specific process.
Exactly. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end. We've now come to the end of the session. There is a coffee break following this immediately for a half hour. And then there's a session on women in QE starting at 8, I guess we'll say the time in the CST time, starting at 12 o'clock. So check your schedule and catch some of the events. There's a special session on the future of qualitative ethnography, promises and challenges is coming up, and then some paper sessions later this evening. Well, for me this evening, in the night, middle of the night, but okay. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for the wonderful presentations, and we look forward to more discussions later today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.